You here this evening for our night that we're calling an evening with Pastor Chatman here seated to my right as we gather here at St. Andrew in the sanctuary. Good to see a few individuals and small groups clumped here in the sanctuary. For those of you who are gathering online with us also, a word of welcome to you too as we learn how to participate fully in our virtual live stream settings. A couple of announcements for us as we want to really engage in conversation and dialogue here, not just between Pastor Kelly and me, but also to you who are attending here in person and those who are online. Dale Riley has a microphone, and he's willing to roam around into the group of people here to hold the microphone for you if you have a question, because it is best that people at home can hear what the question is. For those of you at home, if you have a question, Pastor Gail is monitoring the phone number that you can send your text to. Celeste will put that on the screen now so that you can see that, and she'll be putting it back up online here periodically throughout our broadcast so that people can participate in the conversation, because we really do want this to be a dialogue, because really what this is all about is being in relationship and being in friendship and going through a journey of separation to belonging together. And Pastor Kelly, we thank you for being with us here at St. Andrew again, having been on this stage, so to speak, before with us to talk about you and CLNE. Welcome. Any opening welcoming words from your perspective this evening?
Oh, I want to thank you. This is quite exciting to have this conversation and walk through your response to the book. It's a great opportunity for me, and I look forward to the conversation. And all you folks way in the back, keep it down. This is packed in here. It's absolutely packed.
Indeed, it's packed. It is great to have you here, Kelly. Don't pan too much, Celeste, please, in your videoing of our presentation. It is great to have you here, and I think I met you probably 7 or 8 years ago or so, and we've known each other, but we've gotten a chance to get to know you better, Kelly, because this is my copy of your book, and you can see I've got a few copy drips, and it's been in my backpack, and I've got Post-its in here because our small groups have been reading it here during our IDI small group gatherings and making our way through it. And you've really introduced yourself to me and to all of us in a way that I didn't know you before. And so very personal stories, anecdotes, going back many years, and of course many stories that were not so easy for you to share either in the process. But I wondered if we could just kind of go back to the beginning a little bit, Kelly, and just hear you talk a bit about where you were raised and your upbringing and how faith and the church came into being, for you to help form up your identity as a Christian and as a leader.
Yeah. Well, Peter, it may be a challenge for you to reel me in. So this walk down memory lane is very precious to me, particularly when you mentioned my journey and beginning in terms of faith. My parents both came from the South. They were in Tennessee. My mother in a rural part and my dad a more urban part. And after the Korean War, my father resettled. And part of the great black migration from the agricultural segregated South to the industrial North. So they moved our family to Detroit, Michigan. And we settled in there. And my father worked, a number of jobs. But we didn't have a church home. And I really didn't know much about what the faith background of my parents were, but our parents would have us line up, and I had 11 brothers and sisters.
11?
Yes.
Okay.
And our parents would line us up and have us memorize like the 23rd Psalm, and we would take turns reciting the Psalm, and that was kind of our faith formation in the beginning. And then on Easter, remember that we would get new clothes and we would all march to the nearest church, which was a Baptist church. And so that was our experience of like congregational. It was once a year. We would go to the church on Easter, and it was very exciting and vibrant. And then my father had a rule that if we wanted to go to the movies during the week, then we had to go to the church on Sunday morning by ourselves.
Nice.
And so my brothers and I, we call that taking a dive. That we didn't go to church to go to church. We went to the church to get what we really wanted, which was to go to the movies. And so that was kind of the formation. And then my parents moved us to a new neighborhood. They bought a home, and I was listening in 7th grade to my classmate, Willie Woods, and he was describing how pretty the girls were in his Sunday school. And I wasn't very religious, but when I heard Willie describing how pretty those girls were, I felt a conversion coming on. So I invited myself to visit Willie's church, and I got to the church, and it was in this really nice neighborhood called Indian Village in Detroit, and we called it that neighborhood Mansions when we were growing up. And the church, according to Willie's direction, didn't match my picture of Willie. And so I got up my courage, and I walked up there. I opened the door, and I could hear children singing. And I couldn't see anybody, but I could hear those children. And as I was following those voices, went down the steps and down the hall, and I couldn't see anybody the whole time, but I could hear the children singing. And just as I rounded the corner, there stood the entire Sunday school, and everybody was white. And I was standing there, and this is like 1963, and the tape was going about where you belong and where you don't belong. And I was trying to think about how do I make my exit, and I was also thinking about I'm going to kill Willie Woods, because I thought that he'd set me up. And while I was thinking about how to exit, 2 Sunday school teachers came over, and they gave me some materials about somebody named Martin Luther, and they escorted me to the front of the entire Sunday school. And the Sunday school began to sing these words: "There's a welcome here. There's a welcome here. There's a Christian welcome here."
Wow.
And it's like a reality that I never imagined.
Wow.
And that was really my introduction to church. And from that moment on, I was like, every opportunity I was in church. And so that became my church home. And then my brothers and sisters started going to that church. My neighbors started going to that church. And the year that I graduated from college, my parents joined that church. And so that's really the foundation of my faith story.
A welcoming church that went out of its way to make sure that a young black boy would feel welcomed there, and you were absorbed by it.
I wouldn't say that they went out of their way.
Oh, okay.
God led me to that church, and it was children and Sunday school teachers that welcomed me.
Yeah. Well, in your book here, too, chronicles so many of those stories. I mean, I loved how you wove together these amazing stories of people who were impacting for you in your story, in your history, but then also those other more challenging stories where you felt so alienated or so outside of the norm, and you really brought us into your life and circumstance. I wonder why did you write the book? What was in you?
You're asking great questions. It was around Thanksgiving of last year, and I've been invited into so many conversations with our Lutheran congregations and who have not really had conversations and are hungering for deeper conversations around race. And I just realized I can't be in all those places. And I thought, well, the book would be a way to be present, to open the door, and that the book would serve as a portal to conversations around race. And then maybe whether it's a follow-up conversation with me or with someone else or within the congregation or even in a family to have conversations about race. Now, one of the things that I realized that I would ask people is how many white people have ever been in a home of a black person. I wasn't looking to make a count, but as a rhetorical question to think about how many people have never been in the home of a black person. And I ask that as an example of the divide, the cultural divide of like just everyday kind of human interaction and how the division of race separates us. And so really the book is really to be a portal or catalyst for the conversation. The other thing that I imagined and wanted to be helpful for the book is to have conversations about race without guilt, blame, or shame. And so often what I experience in conversations with white people is the conversation about race doesn't go very far because it triggers guilt, shame, or blame. And so to facilitate conversations that can actually have depth and vulnerability and hope.
I was wondering about when you said the dates of last Thanksgiving or so is when you first started writing the book, because I wondered what the impact was of the murder of George Floyd on you and on your ministry and on your call. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that event and how it's shaping you and the ministry that you're doing.
I don't know that the murder of George Floyd had a lot of impact on me. And or actually black and brown people. But I do feel it had a tremendous impact on white people. And that litany of deaths from Philando Castile, there's so much that I think actually reached that critical point of undeniability, that there's something here, excuse me. And my experience is there's a groundswell and a hunger that people want to really are ready to look more deeply at the issue of race and kind of what's going on.
I wonder, talk a little bit more about what you think that is about our society now. What's different? I mean, what are you seeing out there that's different today than before?
My assessment is, and I'm an expert now that I've written a book, is that for 400 years or more, black and brown people have been saying that racism is a problem. And the response from the white community has been not very much of a response. But with the preponderance of deaths and murders and the video of all of those things, there is a groundswell of heightened awareness and interest. And so that's the response from the white community. And for the black community, I'd say that it's fatigue. And that it's that litany experience of vulnerability and anguish. And so I would say there's heightened white awareness and sensibility, and that ongoing experience of the black community. And now the opportunity to come together is there, and but there's that 400-year history. And the bridge that's needed, maybe a book is one piece of that, but we need a bridge to be in relationship with one another. But I would say the challenge is that for the white community to become more literate, more knowledgeable, more prepared, and then for the black community to develop trust. And so that bridge is what's needed.
Yep. Yeah. Speaking from a congregation like ours here at St. Andrew, which I think is like many other white congregations in the Twin Cities. Thank you, Pastor Matthew.
Oh, even a cup.
We are a white congregation, a suburban congregation, and I think one of the things that we have experienced throughout the episodes you talked about, the Flenda Castillo and others, is that there's a uptick, and then there is a malaise that happens, and an uptick and a malaise that happens. That we don't maintain a kind of a process of engaging these issues. Do you think that this is how do we keep that process alive here? And we can lean into a little bit of the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement as well. But how do we, as a concerned group of people here in Eden Prairie, keep our eye on the ball?
Well, I know you're not throwing me a softball, but I would say St. Andrew is doing a lot of this. You have Church Anew, and there are many ways there that connection of awareness and building relationship, hearing voices that you wouldn't have heard 5 years ago through Church Anew. The Intercultural Development Inventory is another way. So the impetus for that awareness doesn't just come from external, but how you're building that into part of the discipleship of your congregation. So I think that's number one, so that it doesn't wait for a crisis or that disruption to happen. It's you're building that into the culture of your congregation. And my hope is, and assumption is, that will be reflected in your presence in Eden Prairie. So you don't just learn those things for them to not go anywhere.
Right.
But it creates a dynamic that you find those places of application. Now, I don't know that this is what you're asking yet, or you will, but part of this for me is rooted in theology and my experience of church that really begins with my own experience of the church as a place of welcome, safety, and belonging. And what I'm aware of is somebody that entered the church as a child and watched my siblings become a part of that church in my neighborhood, and my parents. I experienced the church as a place where my family was welcomed and they were safe to belong, in a dominant culture where that isn't always the case. And so that promise that is exhibited on Sunday morning in church, that I experience and my family experience, to take that and say that God never intended that be reserved for Sunday morning, right? Welcome, safety, and belonging is the embodiment of our Christology, the incarnation of God. And so if we can do that for an hour, maybe an hour and 5 minutes, then we can take that with us and live that out in the places where we work and we play and we study. And that if we really take what it means to be a worshiping body rooted in the reality of God, then we're called to share that out in those places where we live and do ministry in everyday life. And I believe that can transform our society. And I believe that that's God's intent, is that we take our faith seriously enough that we can change the reality that is on the news every day.
Yeah, we at St. Andrew, our mission statement has been for several years now, living out our faith in daily life. And we joke a bit about how mission statements sometimes come and go, and how this one, it doesn't need to go anywhere, because it is, as your book talks about, there's a time of awareness, there's a time of introspection, and then a time of transformation.
Yeah.
There's a progression and a movement along through that. And so, living out our faith in daily life, ultimately, that's where we want to get to. That's where it needs to be. That's where the impact is made. Yeah.
Okay, make another, since you referenced the book, and you write a book and Pastor Matthew then brings you water. He would have never done that before. So thinking about the book, really part of that was thinking about difference and thinking about how we are oriented in our culture to see difference as negative and as bad. And so when we see somebody who's different, then we tend to alienate them or estrange ourselves from them. And so, but thinking about difference as part of the gift of God, and then actually think about how difference actually as an asset and as a gift. And so one of the points of the book was to have people actually think about when did you experience difference and see that as a positive thing, right? And so thinking of, and the reason I think about that is so often, and this is part of what undergirds the book, as a African American and person of color, so often I go in a store and people see me as different, non-white, and see that as a problem, and stigmatize that. Well, if we could step away from that and see difference as a value, as a gift, and then actually to think about those times when you thought of someone or something as a different, as a problem, and then when you actually experience that person authentically for who they are, and that movement from the difference as a problem to the transformational part of that is when you experience difference as a gift, right? So an example I would say, maybe, and I'm just hypothetically, let's say that there's someone in your family who is gay, lesbian, transgender, and you were oriented prior to that person being in your family to think of that difference as a negative, right? But then when you experience that as your child, your brother, your parent, then you see that difference as something that is transforming, right? So there's a breakthrough with that, and not only in how you see that person, but I would then say how you see God, right? Transcending the boundary of race or class or difference. So the negative often about difference is what comes from a culture or society. But the gift of difference comes from God, right? A God of all creation, a God who creates all people. And so that really is part of that thing about forming to reforming to transforming, was thinking about hopefully liberating us in how we see difference.
Is there a biblical story that illustrates this from Jesus' ministry, the clearest and the best in your mind? Is there one that?
Yeah, they're all those stories in terms of a woman at the well who's seen stigmatized for broken relationships, to how Jesus interacts with the woman and liberates her, and she goes to live new life.
Yeah.
Another story is about an Ethiopian eunuch who is stigmatized and not allowed to worship in the temple because he's a eunuch, and how Philip encounters that Ethiopian eunuch, and they sit in his chariot and they have conversation. And then that Ethiopian eunuch says, "There's some water. What's to stop us from being baptized?"
Let's make it happen.
Yeah. So, I mean, those stories of Scripture, those stories with Jesus is about Jesus coming and embracing difference and teaching us about embracing difference, and that through the eyes of God, right? So there's stories about liberation, I would say. And the liberation is about a liberation to honor the other, to have relationship with the other, to love the other.
How did your writing of the book last fall, or beginning that process, and the creation of the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement mirror each other? Was that all in the same process here, Kelly, or?
Well, yeah, Tim Maudlin had something to do with it. So, and by that, I was pretty comfortable where I was serving my congregation.
Redeemer in Minneapolis.
Redeemer congregation in Minneapolis. And Tim saw something that he thought that I might be the right person to start the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement. So there was that beginning part of it. But we didn't really know what it was. The point about the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement really goes back to the point about difference. And I've had a passion since I've been in Minneapolis to do something about the stigmatization of North Minneapolis. And that whenever I watched the news, whenever I heard a story about North Minneapolis, it was always about how bad it was. And so at Redeemer, I was blessed to be able to do something about that with a congregation and in a neighborhood. And I just thought about this recently. And so at the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement, and it's a result of a campaign between the Minneapolis Area Synod, Lutheran Social Services, and Redeemer Center for Life to have a stronger Lutheran presence in North Minneapolis. And so, and starting that, and being in relationship, we came up with, like doing the intercultural development inventory, and how can we develop partnerships with congregations to facilitate more investment in neighborhood, whether that neighborhood is in Eden Prairie or North Minneapolis, but to actually build relationship between the amazing faith that we share in our congregations. How do we exhibit that out in the neighborhoods? And part of that dream is, if we exhibit that out in our neighborhoods, people will be more likely to be in relationship with our congregations and how they see Lutherans. Right? So, and I would say in a better light than that we're just an ethnic church. So I'm kind of rambling with your question.
No, I think it's the Center for Leadership. Is it the horse before the cart or the cart before the horse? I mean, there is Pastor Kelly at Redeemer for 20 years working with a traditional congregation to see its neighborhood. There was the tragedy this past summer woven into that, but then also the desire to put some of these resources into the hands of these congregations. Something is happening here, leadership-wise, that churches like St. Andrew are able to take advantage of here and step into a new space. Together. So I wonder, as we think about the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement too in the future, I know the pandemic is still around us and changing us, affecting what it is that we do. But I wonder about the presence of the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement for congregations like St. Andrew that are stepping into these places of engagement and learning.
Well, one thing, the sustainability of CLNE is dependent on congregations. So CLNE should not exist just for itself. It needs to be, it needs to facilitate ministry, right? And where I was thinking about that, and is an example of that, is during the Chauvin trial, we came up with an idea to pray each day of the trial.
Yeah.
And so in partnership with Don and Sandra Samuels in North Minneapolis, who are significant leader and presence there, we partnered with them, and we just said we'll pray every morning. And we designed it, 8 o'clock we will gather, we'll have a host each day, and then we would have someone, a reflection leader each day, and it would be an interfaith witness, and knowing that the trial would not just be about Minnesota, but it would be national and international in the attention. Mm-hmm. And so we started doing that, and so 5 minutes of reflection. Today was Bishop Emeritus Mark Hansen was the reflection leader. Mm-hmm. And then we go into 9 minutes and 29 minutes of silence and prayer. So that discipline every day, and that was just CLNE being present and prayerful about God. How can we be of use today?
Yeah.
And so I would say the gift and the strength of CLNE is imagination, right? And response. Another one that we did was for Martin Luther King celebration. We partnered with St. Andrew, mm-hmm. and we had a wonderful Martin Luther King celebration. Mm-hmm. And 4 months later, find out that there are Christians in Cargill that meet, and they saw the video, and now they're connecting with CLNE. Yeah. So it's about following God's imagination, our imagination, mm-hmm. and I pray that will connect with the imagination of congregations, right. And that CLNE will help facilitate things that we don't even imagine yet today. So.
Healing Our City prayer vigil is 8 o'clock in the morning. Is it? Does one access it through clne.org then as a portal to get to it? Well, I know many at St. Andrew are participating in it already, but.
It's healingourcity.org.
Healingourcity.org. Okay, thanks.
And we began at the very beginning of the trial, and we're going to go through the May 26th, mm-hmm. which is one day after the anniversary of the death of George Floyd. Mm-hmm. And then our plan is, in some way, we will continue throughout the year, and a presence and a way for community to come together. And those additional ways would be more programmatic, in ways that congregations like St. Andrew mm-hmm. can not only participate, but help design what it is.
So the sessions that I participated in too, and in the process have been voices of lament. Is the word I know that's been used in it, but they're the authentic voices from communities that I don't normally interact with, perhaps, or that they're voices that I need to hear from faithful people from their perspective, and my role is to listen.
Yeah.
And to listen and to comprehend. There are times when I'm in full agreement. There are times when I'm hearing things that, wow, I wouldn't say it that way, that kind of thing. But these are authentic voices from the community that are. And I missed Mark Hansen's this morning as well. One great leader in the Lutheran Church too. But those voices have been powerful ones for me to just try on for a morning.
Yes, yep. And it's a website. It's www.healingourvoices.org, and it's live from 8 to 8:30, mm-hmm. but it's available on Facebook and YouTube all day. Okay. So you can go on and listen to any of the speakers who've been, and it's been presiding Bishop Eaton, Bishop the bishop of the Episcopal Church for Minneapolis. So there's a wonderful array. Krista Tippett. Mm-hmm. It's amazing the voices of the reflection leaders. And it's not about whether or not you agree with them. Mm-hmm. It's the voices of prayer. And all of the prayer voices are not necessarily about whether or not we agree with them.
Why is it so hard for us today to listen to people and respect them, even though we don't agree with them?
That's the culture that we're living in today, unfortunately. But the real reason is they haven't read the book.
That's right. I'm figuring out what this is all about. No. Well, I do think that people come to our circumstances today with their own experiences. They are authentically their own experiences. And these speakers and these events are being broadcast or shared in social media, in the living room, on all the news channels. These videos are amazing witnesses to the challenges of our society. And it really creates challenges. It's upsetting for everybody. Their experiences are one thing, and what they're seeing is another. And how do we sort this out? You've been, a pastor for many years, Redeemer for 20 years. Here at St. Andrew, we have a rich diversity of people's experiences that we honor and respect, and we're trying to keep a balance here of where we all are, to make sure that our umbrella is big enough, because all of our experiences are valid, as is the need to listen, to try to understand more. That's at least what we believe in a more just world, is to listen, to understand our neighbors.
And do you know why you're able to do that? Welcome, safety, and belonging.
Yeah.
A core value.
A core value. Well, we do want everyone to feel welcomed, to feel safe, and to belong, even if they're on a different part of the continuum of the experience. How do we maintain unity in your mind in the midst of this important diversity? I do find this diversity really exciting, even if it's challenging. That we have a real congregation here of real diverse mixture of people on these issues. I find that very exciting, but how would you say we keep the unity around and within that diversity?
I really do believe that welcome, safety, and belonging,
okay, yeah.
And I'm not making that up.
Yeah.
That is what I discern is kind of the foundation of worship and liturgy. That when we say we worship God, that means everybody, right? And if that container of welcome that we experience when we worship, then why can't we take that container and that experience and expand it into the workplace? So if, for 2,000 years, we've been able to gather and in the midst of difference, right? And you do that here. Why can't we translate that as a core value and what we carry out into the world, right? And I mean, I do believe that the translation of that into welcome, safety, and belonging is what God communicates to us. And we translate that into the container of how we gather and we worship. And we do have the facility to take that with us back out into our families, into our workplaces, and that's more fundamental than our ideologies. And what we do, we make our ideologies what's paramount. And I think the relationship actually supersedes ideology.
When I think about you had a great chapter on ethnocentricity and ethno-relativity, and how our worship is the way that it is. And we had a great conversation in my small group about that chapter. When I think, for instance, about the confession and forgiveness at the beginning of the service, I have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but God embraces me and loves me and forgives me and gives me another chance every day. Stop. safety, welcome, your words, that's there. Then we have all the other things that we do in worship, but we have this very core component, of what our theology says about who Christ is and who God is for us. Though we don't deserve what it is that we get from God, we still get that. Are there things what gets in the way for us in those circumstances? I mean, that's our Lutheran identity. That's what we stand for. But what gets in the way of that?
You referenced like the ethnocentrism, and that ethnocentrism is like, and Milton Bennett talks about this, and that ethnocentrism is that we all have a sense of what the world is supposed to be like, and that's handed down from our parents to their parents to their parents. And so that ethnocentrism is the way that we're oriented, it's supposed to be. And an example is what kind of food you're supposed to eat, what kind of music you're supposed to listen to. And it follows like a kind of a loyalty to that ethnic heritage. And so I would say an example would be in the Lutheran tradition, then an expectation that music is going to be complex. It's going to be like Bach. It's going to be it's going to be like the finest of music that comes out of Europe, right? And then in the African American ethnocentrism, it's like music is going to be repetitious. It's going to be relational. It's going to be jazzy, right? Soulful, right? And so that kind of ethnocentrism, when you think about Sunday morning, how our churches tend to reflect our ethnicity and ethnocentrism. It's what Martin Luther King talked about Sunday morning being the most segregated hour of the week. Well, if you think about how we gather, and we tend to have our worship reflect our ethnocentrism, right? And so it gets into my experience that once I became a Lutheran and I got a scholarship and I started going to a Lutheran school, that process from then on became a process of assimilation, that I had to adapt from my ethnic identity and ethnocentrism as an African American to learn how to speak like white people,
right?
To listen to music. So all those things was like I had to assimilate in order to be heard, in order to be seen. Well, is that really the way that we're called to be in relationship?
Right.
And so when we think about Sunday morning and why a lot of people might not want to come and worship at St. Andrew, it might be because you won't worship for more than an hour and 5 minutes, right? In another tradition, and maybe you wouldn't go to a Baptist church because you wouldn't be willing to worship all day. So that dynamic is like, a lot of our segregation really can be looked at in terms of our ethnocentrism, right? So, but the antithesis of that is what Nolan calls ethno-relativism, where to be in relationship with another ethnicity, to be able to worship in a Latino Baptist Pentecostal church and be okay if it takes 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours, right? Or for a Latino Baptist or a Latino period to come and worship at St. Andrew and say, it's an hour and 5 minutes and we're out of here, and they're just ready to be warmed up, right? Or another example that it's like in seminary, we were taught that a good sermon is, it has 3 points, right? And so if you listen and you don't get those points out of the sermon, then it wasn't a good sermon. But if you go to an African American Baptist church, it may not have a point. Amen? Amen? Amen?
Right.
So it's that dynamic of we want to be at the same table, but we want people to be at our table, right?
Yeah.
They want a table that has lutefisk, right? Well, no, okay.
Yeah,
that's it. But so we don't really negotiate how to be in relationship. Yeah. And,
gotcha.
And so my point is not to be critical,
No.
but to offer the opportunity to look at why are we the way that we are, and why are things the way that they are.
So extrapolating out on that image of ethno-relativism in that openness, 3 weeks ago we had representatives from the Eden Prairie Human Rights and Diversity Commission here in the sanctuary talking about the efforts underway in Eden Prairie to recognize the diversity or not in Eden Prairie and steps moving forward to be more welcoming, to promote more safety and inclusion for people. So they talked a lot about the efforts that are underway. Toward the end of the presentation, if you missed it, they talked some about the quality of life survey that was distributed in 2018 that said that the whites who took the survey said that they were very happy with their life in Eden Prairie and that we are very welcoming. Of the people who represented the BIPOC community answered those same questions, and their answer to the question of is Eden Prairie a welcoming place, the white community said yes. They were not so enthusiastic. We didn't tank, so to speak, but it was not so enthusiastic. It was very lukewarm. And I know this is true in so many suburbs. We're not alone in that. It's a common occurrence. I wonder, in your experience, Kelly, and the way you've studied and engaged, if you can think of ways that communities have successfully attempted and found ways to help make the representatives of our community feel and actually be more welcomed than maybe the way they felt to begin with. Are there some examples that you can lift up from your experience at Redeemer or so forth?
Not many. Sadly, the immediate image that comes to mind where those boundaries are diminished as like protests. And you think about, when I think about protests and I see all those young people that are out doing protests, I think about many of those young people are the young people that went through confirmation in our churches. And we didn't provide discipleship opportunities or ways for them to exhibit their faith in the structure of our faith community. They're exhibiting that out in protests where issues of justice and equality are, and they can fully engage in that. Yeah. So that's one of the things that I imagine. I also think that many of our churches do that, cross the boundary, what they call the ethnocentric divide. The service projects or ways to be in relationship. Yeah. Those are around doing something. One of the things I love about what Bennett talks about ethnocentrism, and he talks about ethno-relativism, is that, but in order to get to ethno-relativism, you have to cross what he calls the paradigmatic divide. And so something has to rupture, something has to break through in order to move from being ethnocentric to being ethno-relative. I think that divide is really the cross. That it's the reality of the cross that allows us to move from me and my and I to that thou, that relationship with the other. Yeah. And so where and how do we break through that egocentric self into a relational reality. And I do believe we can't really do it on our own. We're not oriented to be able to do it on our own.
And the cross of Christ represents for us of vulnerability, suffering, pain.
Yeah.
What else would you, right? Is that
Everything that you're saying,
okay?
grieving the loss of relationship, the awareness,
Hardship in society, disunity.
And maybe you should write a book, because I hadn't thought about this before. But that reality of the grief and the awareness of racism is maybe the cross.
Is the cross too?
Yeah.
Pastor Gail has a question from someone viewing at home.
Yeah, the question is around the ethnocentrism, saying, do we need to change our worship, or do we need to attend other worship experiences?
I would certainly say, beginning with attending other worship experiences. I think of that as learning. I think of that as the learning is the respect and appreciation for the other. I also think, I'm just responding off the top of my head, I think that also connects with the Intercultural Development Inventory in terms of that the gap that exists between our aspiration and how the world experiences us, and what can we do to bridge that gap, to grow an appreciation for not only appreciation, but movement toward being who we aspire to be, being who we understand God calling us to be.
Any questions in the room here as well? Dale is here with a microphone. Okay, back to Pastor Roger.
In your book, one of the things you talked about was one of your first calls. And you were an associate pastor at that time, and you talk about how you were enjoying visiting people, and the word came to you that you may visit some people, but you are not invited to visit all the people. And I think you describe a little bit about how that made you feel, but what I'm curious to know is, how did that get resolved, and were you comfortable and satisfied with that resolution?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for that painful question. It's never been resolved. It's one of the more defeating experiences of my ministry because it was a limiting imagination of the gifts that I had to offer as a pastor of the congregation, particularly to to whoever those people were. It was also very limiting because the senior pastor didn't have a stand.
Yeah.
If I had not been so rooted in my experience of the embrace of the church, it could have been defeating. The other thing about that is it wasn't really a new experience. It was a new experience for me in the church. I don't know if that's answering your question.
Well, it seems to me that senior pastor did not support you.
No, that's...
It seems that senior pastor never really did support you. You know, he was willing to go along with that, which was totally unacceptable as I think about it. You know, and he wasn't willing to take a stand that he said he believed. He didn't really live what he said he was believing.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that was a way of abandoning you and not standing with you.
No, you get no argument from me. And I would say that was his shortcoming. There were two challenges in that. One is that there were at least a couple that felt that way. And the other was the lack of leadership in the pastor. So both of those were very unfortunate.
Yeah.
It was also unfortunate that that was my first call to a congregation. I want to kind of gloss it over and say, but I had many wonderful experiences.
Pastor Gail has another question.
Yeah, it's more of a comment than a question, but maybe you could say more about this. The comment is, I've been incredibly fulfilled by participating in Healing the City virtual prayer tent. I'm so thankful that Healing Our City will continue beyond May 26th. I'm grateful to be connected with people of color as well as people of different faiths. Morphing into a more programmatic format would be great. I don't want to lose that connection. It's helping me learn, understand, and grow. Thank you, Pastor Kelly. With a little P.S., you have a great sense of humor. Perhaps you could go on the road and perform stand-up Christian comedy.
Yeah, right.
Could you write that down on, so I can show that to my wife about the sense of humor? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't hear if there was a question.
It was just a comment, affirmation, for sure. Yeah, that's all. She has another one, though. Go
I
ahead,
do
Pastor
have
Gail.
another one.
Yep.
Maybe a couple of them here. We'll take them one at a time. Recently reading Ibram Keen's How to Be an Anti-Racist, he seems to say that we are all racists and will make mistakes. But what matters is if we are anti-racist, striving to fight our racist tendencies and upbringing, regardless of color. Does this make sense to you?
Could you refer me? It's a little hard to hear you, Gail. That's kind of blurry for me. So.
The speaker system is kind of up above here. So
Okay,
to rephrase the question, I think...
Just wanting to know if the racist tendency, if what matters is if we are anti-racist, striving to fight our racist tendencies and upbringing, regardless of color. Does that make sense to you?
I would say yes, if I understand the question, and that racism, how do I say this? Racism is a condition of our environment. I don't think that anybody can escape being racist in the United States. We can work at being recovering from racism. And it's like the air that we breathe. It's deeply rooted in the history of our nation with slavery and all the ways that people of color, African Americans, Black people in general, were brought to this country as slaves. And that system has been handed down from slavery to segregation to how policing happens, to all of the systems are co-opted by racism. I firmly believe that. And I firmly believe in my own life experience. I had to learn, and I have to continue to learn, how to navigate the system of racism in order for me to be seen as fully human. And that's not just what white culture does to me, it's also what I do to myself. Because I grew up in a system that told me I had little worth, and that the worth that I have is based on how much I assimilate and communicate that the way that I communicate is palpable or affirmed as, for lack of language, that I talk and I act and I function as in ways that are acceptable to white culture. Right? And I don't know if that's fully answering your question, but it's a system that we operate under. And I would say for white people, it's the commitment to try to not let that system define who you are and define how you see other people. And that's a lot of work to do because the consciousness from the time that you are born orients you to that racist thinking. And how do you can't walk out of that. You can't step out of it. It's like breathing. So the best we can do, and the best you could do, it's kind of weird to say, but be the best racist that you can be.
There's a second question here. The author also says we should not expect people of other colors to assimilate with our culture. That in itself is racist. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I don't mean for that to... I wish that didn't sound as defeatist as it sounds. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, I'm telling you from my own experience and from my wife's experience and from everybody black that I know, assimilation is part of the deal. And I would translate the part of what happens with George Floyd and Dante Wright, it's that those places where they don't assimilate and function the way that white culture systems say that you're to function. So an example I would say is that for so many black families, black parents, when they tell their kids before they go out, if the police pull you over, where to position your hands on the steering wheel, that's assimilation. That you're learning how to present yourself in order that you're acceptable to a police officer. So all of those ways that non-white people are taught to conform to a standard that is not innately of their own choosing, that's the kind of system that we're talking about when we talk about racism. And the challenge is, and I thank you so much for this, to be able to have this conversation without you going to a place of guilt and blame and shame, so that we actually have the capacity to have the conversation.
I do have a couple more questions if we want to keep going, but just let me know to stop. One is, how do we begin to address differences in economic and educational opportunity between our minorities and the white community? Poverty seems to be at the basis of those differences.
There's a saying that I remember from the 60s, the civil rights movement, and they said, I'm not trying to change the system, I'm trying to keep the system from changing me. So there's some reality to that, and I translate that, it's like, and I don't really mean this, but to just like temper it some, is I'm not trying to change racism, I'm trying to keep racism from changing me. There's this massive system of racism and white supremacy. And how do we not function and be co-opted of that we're fully human and fully Christian and living in the reality of God? and not the dominant culture.
Pastor Kelly, thanks for your...
We're stopping already?
Well, we're bumping into an hour and 5 minutes. Ethnocentrically, we're at an edge here. I'm starting to feel uncomfortable. No, I'm actually feeling very grateful for your voice, because for us to hear your love and your care and compassion for building community, rather than some of the other voices that we hear that tears down and doesn't seek to build bridges, that comes at it. This from a theological, biblical, story of reconciliation and of togetherness in a community and relationship. Your voice is really important for us to hear. You give us in this book. You come for an evening to talk about these things, but you're not just acquiescing to the culture, but you're helping us understand our culture better so that we can see it more deeply and richly. So thank you, Kelly, for what you bring.
Thank you. Thank you all for welcoming me, providing a safe place, and affirming my belonging.
Yeah.